The general problem with the information age is that we have so much information, but it's like, okay, then what do you do with it, right? More information doesn't necessarily mean better decisions. In fact, what we see a lot is just people being extremely overwhelmed.
Say you're just trying to get some socks. Yeah. You go online and some people are saying it sucks so much that they can't stand it. And other people are like, these are the greatest socks in the world. Yeah. And even if you go to the store, it's like there's so many options for different socks. It's like, that's just for socks.
We're talking about the problems in education. We're not in public school, right? There's plenty of people who will be like, I'm talking about the problems in education. Is that changing your behavior? No. Are you really learning? Probably not. Over the past few weeks, Isla and we have been further postponing our podcast recording because, initially we're like, we want to build up backlog so in case we have to go on vacation or something, we have an extra one. And now,
we did that. But then we went on a trip to China.
Yeah, and now it is Wednesday. And we're supposed to release on Friday. And we're like, oh gosh, what is going on? And I think a lot of it is because we've both kind of been feeling this sort of realization where we've had a huge year of discovery for us in terms of building this understanding of what is going on with the world and what's actually driving all of these huge problems. Yeah. So it's just been a lot for us. And I feel like we've kind of come to this point of clarity where we're like, okay, we've discovered all this stuff and we have all this, and we're like, a lot of it has been emotional processing in terms of the magnitude, right? You take something like a realization and of how people aren't aware of these conscious constructs that we built,
and if it's a good realization, you should be able to apply it to pretty much everything.
Yeah, and it's something where I'm seeing it everywhere, right?
Yeah,
and that makes it very overwhelming. But it also, I feel like we've gotten to a point where a lot of our podcasts follow this sort of structure of, we have this big, mental model realization of here's a way to understand what's going on with the world. And then it'll be extremely dense in terms of how we communicate it. And we're trying to communicate it from a generalized conceptual level because these things are so big.
Yeah, so basically each podcast is looking at it from a different angle of oh, it applies to this, it applies to adventures and going out and seeing new things, what does that actually mean, how does that actually have an effect on you, or it applies to health and sickness, and how does that have an effect on sickness. And then basically we'll have some kind of story or an experience to tell.
Yeah, and I think that part of what we're understanding is that the whole way in which we need to be able to confront these things is something that obviously, we talk to so many people about these things, and we were at a Halloween party and I was talking to two parents about what is going on with the education system, what are the problems that we've been realizing, and then the question is okay, this is a lot, and how to actually apply it. And a lot of it that I've been realizing this year is that you have to be able to internalize the emotional magnitude of these things in order for you to actually believe that you truly understand them, given how big these things are, and especially how big the implications are. And I think that for a lot of people, they can understand okay, there is a problem here. And I think more and more people are seeing there is a problem here. But to even be able to think about what does this mean for me is so overwhelming. And I think that part of
you
what...
you could listen to a podcast hours.
Yeah.
And be oh, okay, there's a problem. There's this little thing, but then you got to actually connect it to everything. And what are the implications of that?
And that's also the general problem with the information age is that we have so much information. But it's okay, then what do you do with it, right? More information doesn't necessarily mean better decisions. In fact, what we see a lot is just basically people being extremely overwhelmed. There's so much stuff out there, and now what do I do?
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the real question. And that's why people will pay for something like a meal plan, where I'm kind of looking at this that's stupid. I could just look at recipes.
Yeah.
But what it does is it reduces all the options.
Yeah.
Right? And then you can just follow this, and then you'll pay extra money for someone to assemble that for you.
It's the paradox option, the
paradox of choice.
Paradox of choice, where it's every single thing, say you're just trying to get some socks
Yeah.
because your socks are too old.
Yeah.
You go online and there are way too many options online, and some people are saying it sucks so much that they can't stand it, and other people are like, these are the greatest socks in the world.
Yeah.
And even if you go to the store, it's like there's so many options for different socks. It's like, that's just for socks.
Yeah. And that's
something so unimportant.
Yeah. And so now when it comes to the most important thing, and especially because we see it in so many areas, in the most important areas, in the areas where it is so ambiguous as to how do you measure success, how do you define success, how do you work towards success consistently. Because if you think about something like parenting, right, when you have like you're raising a child, and that's something that is just, there's so many ways of thinking about it, there's so many different things that you could try to do. And when it comes to being able to apply an understanding of what's going on with the world, what's going on with social media, what's going on with mental health, to an actual situation with the child, and consistently in every single situation with that child, right? That's the difficult part. And I think that part of what we want to do is, especially when it comes to what the solution is, it's going to have to deal in those individual situations, because that's how those things sort of start to change. And I think that ultimately that's how you can even build a conscious understanding, is that you have to actually know how to apply it, right? And that was something that was just really interesting, because I was talking to my grandma in China, and I was talking about how all these kids, they don't have any responsibility, they don't know how to do these things, and she was just agreeing with me. She's like, yeah, all these kids in China, they don't know how to make food or do their own laundry or any of this stuff. And then we go to China, and we see how she's treating her cousin. Yeah. And she's totally spoiling our cousin. She's like, making her food.
It's like, our cousin, she was scared of the stove because she never used the stove. She's never got near the stove. Mm-hmm. And then, but our grandparents were just fine with that. Okay, just make her food.
Like, and then we're like, oh, we should teach her how to do this, cook this. And then they were like, no, she's scared of the stove. And it's like, okay, but she can not be scared of the stove if you just teach her how to not be scared.
She was even scared of playing the guitar. Like, it was like
everything.
How is she supposed to try these things out if she just says she's scared of it?
And then all of a sudden she can get out of doing anything by saying, I'm scared. And it's like, and
you would think if our grandparents were listening to Sube say all these things and agreeing with it and giving examples, that they would actually be applying something like it,
right?
But no.
And then that real understanding has to come from really being able to connect the application. And that's what's also so flawed about our education system, is that you are building this generalized concept of understanding, and then that's just you knowing, instead of actually transforming what you do in the world, right? And that's kind of how we think about learning. Like, no, if you actually learn something, it's going to change your behavior, right? And that's not at all being considered. And I think that that's part of what we're realizing in our podcast is
I don't know if it's not at all being considered, but in terms of the realm of like podcasts and like like manuals and things like that, it's kind of disconnected, where even though we have a podcast and I'm going up there and talking every week, how I learn best is by actually following the lives of the people that I'm really inspired by, because you see these little habits and little things applied in their consistently in their lives, and you see that, and I think that's a lot more powerful if you actually, see that person, admire that person, and think this person's doing well. Than, maybe being told that. But it's like, okay, how do you apply that?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really important to have the right conscious understanding, which is why I think it's been very important. I think it's been necessary for us to go about approaching it in the way that we have, right? Because this has been a lot of exploring our own intellectual curiosity as to how do we build a better understanding of these things? Because ultimately, to understand something, you want to have both pieces, right? It's not like you want to be able to do the right things, but then you also want to understand why, right?
Yeah.
And not, because sometimes people can build an intuition for like, you know, and you could see this a lot in like YouTubers, and they'll find this intuition of like, oh, if I do this thing, it'll get more engagement. But then do they actually understand the mechanism? Not necessarily, right? And ultimately, you do want to understand the mechanism behind it. And I think that a lot of what we've been understanding is like, okay, we want to have the right generalized understanding, and then being able to feel that magnitude and really internalize what this means. But then I think at a certain point you understand what is required to get people to this point, because it's not like we're thinking about this conscious understanding in isolation with no feedback loop and no application, right? Like a lot of the application for us has been in our own lives and relationships and how we talk to people and what we do for ourselves. Like, you know, we're talking about the problems in education. We're not in public school, right? There's plenty of people who will be like, I'm talking about the problems in education. And then like, okay, is that changing your behavior? No. Are you really learning? Probably not, right? And so I think that there's kind of this new sort of understanding of, you know, of, okay, well then what does it require for that change? And it has to be coupled with, the high level understanding has to be coupled with, then how do you apply it? How do you really feel that difference in your life when it comes to approaching small decisions, right? And not just the really big ones, but the everyday when you're talking to your kid or your spouse or your sibling or your friend, right? And what do you say and what do you do? And I think that a lot of it has to come down to a more granular perspective that is similar to kind of what we talk about in terms of like, you can have this super conscious understanding, but you want to be able to really have that experience aspect to it. And in our podcast on adventure, it's like you talk about like running or like going on a new route in the walk, and what does it do? It reduces your rates of Alzheimer's, and that's it. It's like, no, that's not how it feels. It's not what it's actually doing in terms of experience.
It's well, yeah, I mean, when you're actually experiencing it, it's hard to, like, how are you supposed to describe and try and put into words like the feeling of just being content and happy? Like, when you hear me say that, I think you understand what I mean, but it's very hard to actually put those things into words and explain it. So the idea of just being like, oh, reduces the rate of Alzheimer's is just very reductive, and that I think can be applied to a lot of things, in the sense that if you're trying to look at it from a perspective of, let's just see the objective consequences here, then that can be very reductive for a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of what we want to do, is we want to be able to take these generalized constructs, which we have not been perceiving as reductive, right? Because it hasn't been the way that we've been approaching things, right? It's not simply that the world is this understanding of the world that we have, but it's like we're seeing these things like, whoa, right? And that's the response we're having to these realizations. But at the same time, it can be difficult to really actually apply that aspect of experience into it in a way that really kind of communicates that. And this is something that I was telling you about in terms of thinking about relationships, is that we're always trying to like understand people. When I was younger, I was really into personality types and understanding like, you know, what are these frameworks for understanding people, right? And that can be really, really helpful. But then at the same time, it's not like, okay, you're your personality type. Of course not, right? That's extremely reductive. It
can be very hard. For me, that's something I ran into, because we'd be talking about these personality types and these archetypes all the time. And then my mind would just want to label people. Right. But then I'm like, okay, but that's so reductive in terms of like, you know, what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing when I'm hanging out with this person. Maybe they don't have a lot of the traits that seem like the ideal person, but you know, they're still a person. I can still dig deeper. Like, I don't know. Right. You know, and you need both, and both are necessary. But you want to be careful about too much conscious. And I think that's one of the reasons why we were delaying the podcast so much. Is because we're just like, I don't know. It felt weird to be looking at things from a too much of a conscious perspective.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that part of it is a lot of what we're doing is we're thinking about our experiences, and we want to try to communicate that. But to do that in a way that is actually going to encapsulate the whole experience is really, really hard, right? So then we try to talk about it in a generalized format to try to communicate the point. But I think that in doing so, you can completely miss the point, right? If you're not actually considering that. And that's part of what I was telling you in terms of we've like crafted this ideal as to what is it that we're striving towards. And like especially in our sibling relationship, we have such a strong ideal as to here's what we're going for. We want to be able to have shared understanding, we want to be able to have trust, we want to be able to flow together, we want to be able to have shared goals and shared direction.
And we've
right?
definitely experienced that.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the time. So, when it doesn't happen, we're just like, no, we need to get back to that, like get back to that as quickly as possible because we have this idea of such a good relationship.
Yeah.
It can kind of be hard when we're looking at other relationships
right.
and you're comparing it to that.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, it's not
what it could be.
It's not what it could be.
Yeah. And that's the difficulty of having an aim, of having an ideal, of having a goal that you're striving towards is that then you have something to compare everything that you're seeing, right? It's a value judgment. I think it's really part of what we talk about is it's really important to have value judgments because otherwise you don't have any values, you don't have any way of understanding meaning, and then you're just kind of aimless, and that's not good, right? But at the same time, then it can be difficult to appreciate the individual aspect of just sharing a moment with someone instead of like, we'll just, come back and be like, oh, it's just this archetype and it's this thing that's going on, right? But it's like that is simplified, that is reductive. And I think part of what the solution to these problems has to bring is not just understanding. And I think that's part of the difficulty of how people approach these problems is we kind of want to explain them. But then it's like, okay, we have an explanation, but we're not done here, right? Then you need to be able to actually to change things. And, when it comes, and that's really, really hard. Like, for example, with Jonathan Haidt, he's drawing this correlation between, mental health problems and social media, right? And that's an explanation. But then it's so hard to actually affect that into like nuanced change, which is why oftentimes it isn't nuanced. It's take the phone away. And then we're not considering, okay, but then young people still need to know how to use technology and leverage that for success and value creation, right? And all that's
just
being
be like,
missed.
Turn the power off.
Throw our phones in the ocean and frolic in the grass. And it's like, okay, now what, right? That's not a solution. That's a way to try to get some kind of change, but it oftentimes people take this perspective of we need to make it really simple because it is really hard to do it in a nuanced way. But I think that part of the whole problem is that it's so hard to be able to do that in a way that is individualized, which is why, but there is so much opportunity there. And I think that that's part of what we want to be able to consider. But I think that there's an opportunity there in terms of considering what are the different points of decision and the moments that make up the majority of our lives that we can view in a different kind of lens, and I think that that's part of what's preventing change from happening is that we all have kind of an autopilot that's just kind of driving us in this predefined direction. And I think all it takes is a reconsideration on the different steps along the way as to, is this really where I want to go? And I think that being able to consider all the nuance of a individual perspective and of knowing that this is a really hard problem in terms of you see this problem in education, but then you need to come up with an alternative before you just throw it all in the trash, right? Throwing it in the trash isn't a solution. And that's a lot of what, when it comes to a point where societies get to a point of these institutions aren't working, often it is a very, let's burn it to the ground sort of mentality instead of, no, we need to build something better afterwards. Otherwise, we're just living in a fiery rubble. That's not good, right?
And is that really better?
Yeah. And that's something I was talking to one of our neighbors about. I was saying I was studying for the SAT and then I got to a point where it was basically just test hacking, and I was just thinking, well, this isn't worth my time. But I had a framework for understanding what is worth my time. and I have an alternative to what I want to do with my life. And I think that you have a lot of young people who are seeing that this isn't working. I don't see how these grades and these facts are helping me. But then, do you have an alternative, right? And
a lot of the time, it's like
oftentimes it's
no,
yeah,
like everything sucks. Yeah, and you just gotta
let's burn the system. Yeah, it's like, and it's just like, okay, but that's not, but it is hard to find an alternative, right? You have a lot of people building these institutions because they thought it was the right thing, right? And so in order for you to come up with something better, that's a hard thing to do. And that's part of what we need is we need that mindset of what built these institutions in the first place, which was a recognition of the problems of how we need to create value in order to, operate together successfully. And I think that, that's part of what we are kind of considering as to what this, next step has to bring, which is that generalized, taking that generalized understanding and being able to apply it in the simplest, smallest things. And being able to draw that connection, because it's really hard to know, okay, I need to help my kid understand, like have a life where they understand their meaning, their purpose, and find things fulfilling, and to actually have a sense of responsibility, right? Okay, that's great. Yeah. How do you do that at breakfast when they just woke up? Yeah. How do you address them in the morning, right? How do you actually engage with them in that way in a conversation that applies that understanding, right?
How do you have a long-term plan when your 2-year-old wants to eat a cupcake for breakfast and you're like, no, you can't eat a cupcake for breakfast, but it's like what you want to teach them independence, so it's like how are you supposed to approach that?
Yeah, and there's all these, and I think that the real problem now is I think that for obviously you want to keep growing and you want to keep learning and you want to keep adapting your understanding. But we have gotten to a place where it's like, okay, once you have to know how to apply that understanding, right? And I think that given this framework, given the principles, and given the direction that we see is what every conversation we have with a parent, it's what they're asking for, right? And then how do we actually really address that in the way that is the difficult part, which is, it's easy to come up with some explanation for what's going on, right? And it's hard to actually come up with an accurate one, right? And we've done a lot of work to try to do that, but it is really hard to then say, like, well, then we need a solution. We need to be able to consider these individual decisions at the level of the experience when there is a lot more color to these things, and so I think that that's part of what we feel like is the way to do that. And for me, as someone who is more conscious dominant, I'm still talking about it in a very generalized way, but I think that is
that's
the
what
step
we want to switch to with the podcast, and we're not sure how to do that yet, but we know we're gonna try and go in that direction.
Yeah.